Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this class. I am so excited that we have such a response to this book, Mere Christianity. The course is called Case for Christ because originally these radio talks that were given by C.S. Lewis were called Case for Christ or Case for Christianity. And then it turned into this book, Mere Christianity. So why don't I begin with a prayer and then we can jump into our study. Let's pray. Lord God, we thank you for this opportunity to study your word and ideas that hopefully open up our hearts to who you are so that we would have a stronger faith in you, and then also give us the tools to also make a case for Christianity to those who might be struggling. We thank you for the wisdom that you've allowed us to enjoy through C.S. Lewis, and then help us to use our own gifts to further your kingdom. Be with us this evening and help everything that we do be done according to your will, and don't let anything I'm doing get in the way of the work of your Spirit. Amen. All right. Well, before we get started, I just want to remind you something I've been saying, but it's starting to get a little traction. We have a discipleship app that I created, kind of something that we're working through and learning more about, but it's called Your Daily Victory. So you can go to your app store, Your Daily Victory. It's on your Apple App Store. It's on the Android App Store and Google Play. Your Daily Victory. And in the Your Daily Victory app, there's a daily practice that you can follow. So every day I do a kind of a daily practice. I have them all scheduled for the rest of the year. A prayer, of generosity, of study. So one small thing to do every day, your daily victory. And then there's also a tab on there for Victory U. And in that card, there's the handouts. I'll have videos, archive videos of this class, other tools. We put some YouTube links on there, so your daily victory is there. So, all right, well, let's jump into our handout. I'll kind of be walking through this. It'll be kind of the outline. I'll try to stick pretty close to it. And then at the end, we'll take some time for questions. We're going to kind of keep it more of a lecture style for a little while. Hopefully, I can keep your attention. If getting dull or you're falling asleep, just raise your hand and we'll try to break things up a little bit, but then we'll end with some discussion. So if you have some questions as I'm talking, write them down and we'll take some questions at the end. Sound good? All right. So C.S. Lewis, who was he and why are we studying him? Here are just some facts, some background. C.S. Lewis was born in November 29th in 1898 in Belfast, Ireland. At a young age, his mother passed away and his father never really recovered. He kind of always was despondent. So him and his brother kind of grew up with an absent father. So when their mother died, he says in his autobiography, we lost both our father and our mother. So he had to learn how to be very almost independent and learn how to raise himself. And he was very gifted from very young on. He started reading when he was 3 years old, started writing when he was 5. You'll see some of the books that he's written, that he's most known for. He's written quite a few books, but maybe the books that you're most familiar with are the Chronicles of Narnia. If you read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, some of those are turned into a movie. Basically, it's the story of Jesus, and Disney turned it into, I think it was written by Disney, turned into a movie. So it's just amazing how the reach of this kind of allegory of the life of Jesus. Screw tape letters are letters that were kind of a story of, he looks at what it would be like if a demon would be writing to Satan about how to tempt people. So it's a very dark story to read, but I was really thinking maybe in the new year, if this goes well, maybe we would look at screw tape letters and kind of understand what we're up against, because C.S. Lewis had some interesting insights on how God works and also how the devil works. Problem of Pain, he also wrote some other fiction, like Paralandria is another one that he wrote. And then tonight we're going to look at Mere Christianity. Some other facts about his life: he fought in World War I, and through in a young age, he grew up in kind of a Christian home. Many people were baptized and grew up inside of the church. He actually said he was confirmed, but even when he was confirmed, he already had kind of renounced faith. As he was growing up, he just kind of thought Christianity seemed it's too much like the myths that he read. And he kept on growing up just saying, you know what, I think this just seems too much like make-believe. And so at a young age, he started questioning his faith. He started renouncing his faith. He became a functional atheist at a very young age. He dove into the classics and literature. He was just an incredible scholar. If you read his autobiography, he didn't want anything to do with sports. He thought that was a waste of time. It wasn't for him. He hated dances and social gatherings. He was much more comfortable reading a book. So he read all of the classics, was a scholar in literature, well known for his his studies in Greek and Latin and German and French and Italian, and just was a scholar when it came to languages. After the war, after World War I, he was injured in the war. He went to Oxford and graduated with honors, started teaching, still kind of a functional atheist, but he had some really interesting friends, even as he became an atheist, a materialist, that started deconstructing his atheism. Today it's pretty popular to hear about Christians deconstructing their faith and questioning Christianity. Well, he started to question his atheism because he thought all Christians were basically just didn't think enough. They weren't smart enough. They weren't intellectually savvy enough. They just hadn't read enough, until he started reading people like G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton was a very thoughtful philosopher, and you can read his famous work, Orthodoxy, and some of his other works. And he started reading, he said, this guy is thoughtful, smart, and he's Christian. And it started messing with him a little bit. And then some of his good friends he started to see were thoughtful, well-read, and they had this particular view that they actually believed this Christianity stuff, and it messed with him. And he had this group of people that would meet in a pub called the Inklings, and in that group were people like J.K. Tolkien, and Tolkien, who wrote The Lord of the Rings and some of those other famous works. And he was a Catholic. And again, he said, Tolkien, he messed with me also. He was this thoughtful, well-read, top of his class kind of person. And he was a Roman Catholic, something that he thought he would never be interested in. And it really started to mess with him, changed his views on God. And he started to actually be open to it. And here's some just kind of something from the online Encyclopedia Britannica, just a little short summary of some of these things. It says, Lewis had rejected Christianity in the early teens and lived as an atheist through his 20s. Lewis turned to theism in 1930, although he misstated that in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, which if you're interested in him, I would really encourage reading Surprised by Joy. And then he became a Christian in 1931, partly with the help of his close friends, the Roman Catholic J.R.R. Tolkien. Lewis described these changes in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, on the account of his spiritual and intellectual life through his early 30s. So it's really fascinating. He started to see that this idea of materialism just wasn't going to hold up, just believing that there was no such thing as any kind of spirituality, and he just couldn't handle that anymore. And he became a theist for a while, and then he converted to Christianity. Okay, so that's a little background on C.S. Lewis. Now, why are we studying him now, and why is there such a response? I mean, we have a nice group here. There's over 22 computers online that are watching us live, and why are we interested in this today? Well, let's think about the scenario that C.S. Lewis is in, and let's think about what we were in. In World War I, really decimated Christianity and so many of the ideals in Europe. When that happened, that was just like, they said that this war that was going to end all wars, and it just was so tragic, so devastating. It had this kind of just extinguished Christianity in Europe. That was kind of the date that really kind of leveled Christianity. And so now they had an opportunity to start over. World War II started getting them, the world to think. And he was asked to do a series of radio talks. And so that's what this book originally was, a series of radio talks during World War II. Now, what's so fascinating about these radio talks is he really doesn't talk much about World War II. It's just kind of a general introduction to Christianity if you were starting from scratch. And I think that's why these have stood the test of time, because they're just so general. I think this book will be read today. I think it'll be read 20 years from now. I think it'll be read 100 years from now. And there are so few books. There are really a handful of books on Christianity and apologetics and conversion and those things. Really only a handful of books that have stood the test of time. This is one of them. That's why we had such an issue with ordering them. We ordered a bunch, and you go on Amazon and they're all sold out, and this book keeps on getting sold out time after time. Okay. So these talks is really the idea of how do you start out with Christianity if you're starting from scratch? If you have no belief whatsoever, if you've renounced it, how do you start over from scratch? Well, why is that so important for today? Well, you think about what we've been through these last 20 years. We just remember, not celebrate, we remember the 9/11 tragedy, right? And that changed everything for our world, for our country. We think about the economic crash in 2006 and through 2008. We think about the digital revolution, that's turned everything upside down, what that's done to people's faith. I mean, we used to live in kind of these isolated communities, and if people had questions, they would talk to their parents or their church. But now, because of things like YouTube, people are exploring things from anywhere. And if you wanted to follow the algorithm, if you wanted to question your faith, you can click on a couple videos, and they'll send you the next one, and that'll send you the next one, that'll send the next one. And in an afternoon, you could totally destroy your faith, no problem, right? And so, as Pastor Bill said last Sunday, our young people, Generation Z, people are in their early 20s, are really the first post-Christian generation in the history of our country. So now, if we're reaching and trying to talk to any of us, ourselves included, if we have questions, how do you build a faith if you're starting from scratch? If you're post-Christian, if you have no interest in Christianity, if you know background in Christianity, how would you start investigating Christianity from the ground up? And that's what this is all about. And that's what we're going to talk about especially tonight. How do you start from scratch, okay? All right, so you can turn to the next page. Let's dive in to the book. All right. So the book there's 4 books in this book. The first book is called Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. And so there are 5 chapters in this book, and that's what we're going to go over this evening. This is a really interesting place to start out, that right and wrong and morality is the start of kind of understanding if Christianity is true. Not usually where people start. Usually, a lot of times people start with arguments from science, trying to prove God with scientific arguments or philosophical arguments. But C.S. Lewis decides, all right, if we're going to start from scratch, this is what we're going to do. And he begins his radio talk, begins the chapter by saying, listen to the way people talk. That's how you can know there's a God. Listen to how people talk. And so when you listen in on conversations, what do you hear? And he talks about somebody saying, hey, you shouldn't have done that to me. I said that, or, give me a piece of your orange. You said, I gave you a piece of mine. And you listen to people and they're arguing. And when they're arguing, you listen to people argue, they always seem to give the impression that there's this standard that the other person should comply to. When they say, hey, you can't hit me, or why did you take that? That wasn't right. And nobody says who, because you both have this kind of understanding that there is this standard that we're both supposed to agree on. And so that's where he begins. And you hear the same thing today. All the different social issues that we're talking about, politics and racism and the pandemic and all these different things. And you just listen in on people's arguments. And they don't always give a reason why, but hey, that's not right. You shouldn't be racist. And we agree, yeah, that's not right. Why is that? Or we should care about this part, or we should care about this thing, or this thing is important. And you hear this argument, and they're appealing to some standard that you both know that's there. And maybe you're saying, but you didn't think about this, but what about that? None of these arguments would have any basis unless there was a standard that we all, hypothetically, even without knowing it, consciously, we are all adhering to. And so here's a quote from page 3. You'll see it up on the screen. Josh, if you want to go to that first quote here, it's on page 3 of your book, it says this. Now, what interests me about these remarks, when you hear people arguing, is that the man who makes them is not merely saying that the other man's behavior does not happen to please him. He is appealing to some kind of standard behavior which he expects the other man to know about. All right? So he's saying, if you want to start at a baseline and try to figure out if there is a God, listen to people argue. Which it's pretty easy to hear that, right? Just listen to people argue. Plenty of people arguing. Okay? Now, he anticipates an objection. Maybe something else I should say here. What's so fascinating about this book is if you read C.S. Lewis's autobiography, Surprised by Joy, you hear C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity kind of speaking to his younger self. He knows what it's like to be an atheist. He knows the objections to Christianity. He knows the objections that he had. And so he's anticipating what the old C.S. Lewis and all of his atheist friends or people who maybe struggled with Christianity, what they struggle with. So he's anticipating some of these objections. So that's what makes this such a fascinating read, is he knows what it's like to not believe anything or not believe in Christianity. So here he says, there's an objection. Doesn't this standard of morality differ based on history and civilization? So someone might object, well, yeah, you say there's this standard, but don't all civilizations have different standards? Like if I would go over to Asia, wouldn't they have different standards of morality? And maybe in ancient Europe, wouldn't they have a different standard of morality? And maybe the Aztecs or the Mayans or the ancient Greeks or the Romans. He says, yeah, superficially they might have some differences. They might, he says in the book, some might say you can have different ideas on how many people you can marry, but nobody says that you get to marry anybody you want or take somebody else's spouse, right? Yeah, they might have different ideas of murder or war or rules of war, but nobody says it's good to just go around carelessly murdering people. So these standards may be superficially are different in culture and community, and he would know as a expert in history and language and culture, superficially different, but there is no culture that supports or encourages selfishness. There's no culture that supports a lack of courage. There is no culture that supports a lack of integrity. These are just universal truths across time, across culture. So where did we get this kind of universals, these standards, okay? And so at the end of this first chapter, he comes to make these 2 points. So if you want to go to these 2 points. Number 1, it seems then that we are forced to believe in a real right and wrong. There's such a thing as morality. Someone says, no, I don't believe it. In reality, all right, punch him in the, I don't do this, but if you punch him in the face, all of a sudden they say, hey, that's not right. Says who, right? So we have to believe we all have to, we believe there's such a thing as right and wrong. And then here's the second point that kind of catches us off guard. None of us is really keeping that law. There's such a thing as right and wrong, number 1. And number 2, none of us is pulling it off. And that puts us in kind of a bind. So there's this standard that we didn't make up, that we all adhere to, but nobody's living up to it. All right, that's the end of chapter 1. Now, is this biblical to make this argument for the existence of God as a moral argument, as an argument from conscience. Well, Paul does the same thing in Romans. In Romans chapter 1, when Paul is writing to Rome, this is what he says. Although they, the Gentiles, people who don't have the Bible, although even people who don't have the Bible know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. And then the next from Romans. Indeed, when Gentiles, again, people who don't have the Bible, who do not have the law, do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. And then the next slide. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, at other times even defending them. This is basically the whole point of tonight's class. C.S. Lewis is saying, how do we know there is a God? Because there is a law written on our hearts. And wherever there is a law, there is a lawgiver. And Paul is saying what C.S. Lewis is saying, across cultures, even people who don't have the Bible, show that they give evidence to God because they have this law written on their heart. They don't need the law necessarily written on the tablets of stone, the 10 Commandments, because they already have the law written on their hearts called a conscience. Okay? So what C.S. Lewis is doing here, without ever mentioning the Bible yet, is doing something very biblical. What's interesting about the letter to the Romans, Paul is writing to a congregation that he's never really met. He's writing to Rome, and he's kind of giving a treatise very similar to the case for Christianity, for mere Christianity. The letter to the Romans is very similar to this book in many ways. So they open up in the same way. All right. Very good. So that's chapter 1. That's the first night, or that was the first radio broadcast of the first chapter. How we doing? Everybody staying awake? Still good? Okay. So now again, C.S. Lewis is anticipating objections because he's thinking, all right, what would I have said 20 years ago, 10 years ago, or at least 1944, he was still, 20 years earlier, he was an atheist. What were my objections? And actually, when he was giving these talks over the radio in 1944, again, during World War II, he was getting letters written to him. Like, okay, that's fine, I appreciate what you said, but here are some of my objections. So now he's going to walk through some of the objections. Objection number 1, isn't morality just herd instinct? Isn't this just part of our instincts that we're instinctively... Isn't that Darwinian? Darwin was in the 1800s, so Darwinian evolution had already kind of swept through Europe. And so people are saying, this is just Darwinian evolution. We're just survival of the fittest. And morality is just another survival mechanism that we all have built into us because, if we keep the golden rule of morality, we'll survive longer. If we keep killing each other, we're not going to survive. And so isn't this just kind of herd instinct? And he responds to that. He says that instincts are distinct from morality. Some instincts are good and some need to be suppressed. He says, okay, if it's just based on our instincts, give that a try. Every instinct that comes into your body, live that out. See how that works out for you, right? In the words of Sheryl Crow, if it makes you happy, it can't be that bad, right? Try it out. And he's saying that won't work. Sometimes we have an instinct to love people, and sometimes we have an instinct to love ourselves over loving other people. And he says in this chapter, if you would follow whatever instinct you have to the extreme, even loving your family. Sometimes you love your family so much that you become codependent on needing their response, needing them to love you back, right? where that can be unhealthy. So he says, any instinct that you say is the definition of morality in my life, and you make that the only thing you follow without question, is going to be a problem. So instinct can't be the answer, because there's sometimes we need to encourage our instincts. Like when you need to be courageous and you have this feeling, I need to be courageous right now, you want to encourage that. And sometimes you need to resist your urges, right? Sometimes you need to say, no, I feel this way, but I can't do that right now. That would be wrong. And so there's something even above our instincts. And he says this in this quote, this next quote here. By the way, this point is of great practical consequence. The most dangerous thing you can do is to take any one impulse of your own nature and set it up as the thing you ought to follow at all costs. There is not one of them which will not make us into devils if we set it up as the absolute guide. Okay? So he answers that objection. Oh, isn't morality just herd instinct? All right, try that out. Live according to your instincts. How's that working out for you? That's basically what he says. Okay. Objection number 2. Isn't morality just a social convention that we learn from our parents? So isn't this just something we get passed on from parent to people? Isn't this just something we kind of, as like a social contract that we've all agreed upon and we teach them to our children? Well, so what? He says basically. Just because you learned it from your parents doesn't mean it's not true. 1 + 1 = 2, whether your parents teach you that or not. And just because your parents taught you to not steal or to be nice or to finish your homework or to do the right thing doesn't mean it's not true. And just because we teach these things and we learn them from our parents doesn't mean they're not true. It's true regardless if we learn it or not. Now, it's helpful when our parents can teach us that and help correct our conscience and maybe help us calm some of our instincts down or encourage some of them. But just because we're taught it doesn't mean that it's not true, right? So here's a quote that he has to say, that he kind of used a pretty helpful illustration. The reason why your idea of New York can be truer or less true than mine is that New York is a real place, existing quite apart from what either of us thinks. If when each of us said New York, each means merely the town I imagine in my head, how could one of us have a truer idea than the other? And he goes on to talk about this a little bit. If there's such a thing as New York, and I have one idea of New York in my head and you have another idea, maybe you heard of it from somebody, and then I saw a picture, and then maybe somebody else actually went there. We all have different ideas of New York, but someone's idea is truer than the other because New York is a real thing. And maybe one person learned of it, one person saw it, one person experienced it. But however we got that information, there's still something that's true called New York outside of us. And that's kind of what C.S. Lewis is saying. There's still something that's true outside of us called morality. However we learned it, and some of us have a truer understanding of that, and some of us have a less understanding. Some of us don't have a clear understanding of morality. Some of us has what the Bible calls hardened our hearts or dulled our conscience. Okay, very good. I'm going to grab some water. Why don't we all stand up real quick? Everybody do a stand up. Give somebody a fist pump next to you. Say, I'm learning something deep. My head hurts. All right. Very good. Very good. We good? Get the blood flowing again? All right. So now C.S. Lewis is still going to keep pressing this idea. All right, is there really something out there called the law? Can I really believe that there is such a thing that's outside of me, that I didn't make up, that we all follow, this like hard and fast thing, something as real as 1 + 1 = 2, something as real as gravity, something so real that it actually needs a lawgiver, okay? Well, he says, yes, this law is it's what's unique about the law is it's as true as gravity, but we don't follow it like a rock follows gravity. You throw a rock and a rock falls, and that's the law of nature because it's going to happen every time nature follows us. C.S. Lewis says morality is called a natural law because we all have it inside of us. The difference is we don't always follow it. That's what makes it so different. But he says it is real. It's something outside of us. It's something that we can't contradict. It's something that you go to other people and they already know about. Kids already know about. They have a conscience. If you don't even teach kids this, they will have it. It's something that is in us. It's something that's out there that you can really understand. Okay, and here's a quote that he says from that chapter 3. I don't have too much on that chapter, but he says, consequently, this rule of right and wrong, or law of human nature, or whatever you call it, must somehow or other be a real thing, a thing that is really there, not made up by ourselves, which we find pressing on us. You see, if we would have made it up, if we would have made up morality, wouldn't we have made up something a lot easier to follow, right? Morality is like, to be good means eat chicken wings or something easy to follow. But it's this thing like to love other people as you love yourself. That's something none of us is actually pulling off. So have integrity all the time. Be courageous in the face of hardship. These kinds of things. We would never have thought this up on our own. We would never have invented this. But we find it pressing down on us. We find it confronting us. We find it challenging us. So that's another way that it proves that it's actually true. It's actually true. Okay. Now he gets into some things that this is my favorite section, favorite chapter, what lies behind the law? What lies behind the law? So if we have this law that we would have never made up because it's something that's actually pressing on us, something that we're actually not following, again, a rock follows gravity. Every other animal in nature follows the laws of nature. They follow their instincts. Dogs follow their instincts. We are the only part of creation that has this law in our life that we don't follow because we didn't make it up. So, who's behind it? How do we find that person? How do we find the thing that created this thing that we wouldn't have made that we find pressing on us? And he says there are different views of the universe on how we got here, and people have been thinking about this from the very beginning. This is not something new. So here are the two different views of the universe. Number one is materialism. So you could believe that only matter exists. And this matter spontaneously started itself and keeps itself going all by random, unguided, chaotic chance. This is kind of that Darwinian evolution idea that even morality is not really a thing at all. You can try to force yourself to believe that it's not, that there's no supernatural, that everything is just kind of here by random chance. There's no purpose, there's no meaning, there's nothing behind it. It's just atoms, it's just stuff. A chair is no more important than a person. There's no value. It's just materialism. So he says that's one view. And he says some people have held that forever. He was a materialist for through his teens and his 20s into his 30s. C.S. Lewis was a materialist. That's what he believed. And he says then there's the religious metaphysical view that what is behind the universe is like a mind, something like a mind that has thought up the laws of nature, but also the laws of morality. So those are the two views. There's not thousands of religions. There may be different types of religion, but basically they all fall into these two categories. And we'll break them down throughout this book as well. But So, how do you find which of these are right? Do we live in a materialistic view, a world, universe, where it's just matter and nothing matters? Or do we live in a metaphysical world? Which one? Well, C.S. Lewis says that you can't find this out by science. And this is an interesting point because I think for the last, 20, 30 years, we've been trying to find God through science. And I think there's probably more you can do and I'll get to that, but here's what he says. You cannot find out which view is the right one by science in the ordinary sense. Science works by experiments. It watches things behave. Every scientific statement in the long run, however complicated it looks, really means something like, I pointed the telescope to such and such at a part of the sky at 2:20 a.m. on January 15th, and I saw so-and-so. Do not think I'm saying anything against science. I'm only saying what its job is. And so he says, if we learned everything about science, we still would not be able to answer through science origin questions and purpose questions. So, for example, I've heard it this way. If I had a chocolate cake here, I could do science on that chocolate cake, right? I could break it down and find out, put it in beakers and do testing experiments on it and find out the ingredients that are in a cake and what kind of chemical reactions have to happen to make a cake happen and do all these scientific experiments. But I can't ask the metaphysical, religious questions like, who made it? Why did they make it? Well, my wife made it for me. It was my birthday. And I can do all the sorts of scientific experiments on that, and it won't be able to answer the purpose questions. So C.S. Lewis says, if we answered all the scientific questions, that doesn't erase God. Because you're just saying what something is, but you can't go from an is to an ought or a why. Ought is morality question. Why is purpose and origin questions. And doing science, looking at something, observing it, breaking it all down, chopping it up, looking at how it works. Or another way to look at it, like I can study the Model T and I can know everything about the Model T. That doesn't exclude Henry Ford, right? And so doing science is asking different questions than origin questions. Now, I think he might go a little bit too far because I think there's one thing you can kind of do with science that I think is still scientific. When you look at something and you see design, you can make the inference that whenever there is design, there's usually a designer. So, I guess I get what he's saying. I think he's right on this. I think sometimes we get too caught up in this. But I do think that it is still interesting to think about, like DNA. Our DNA is a genetic code that we're starting to learn. And every time you see a code, a language, you always have an author. Like if there would be ripples on the sand, I could say, that was random, that those ripples in the sand were from wind that came over the sand. And yes, they're organized and they're beautiful and they have kind of an intricate design to them, but there's no purpose to them. But then if I came along the sand and I'm walking along there and I saw written in the sand, I heart Emily, I knew that somebody must have written that. It had to come from a person. Because randomness, something that a mind has to be behind information. Information always infers a mind. Well, what is our body filled with? Every cell is filled with information, genetic code. So that would be one area where I think, you can do science and make, you can kind of play it backwards. You can see design. I look at a cell phone and I say, I can study everything in here and I see, there's purpose here, there's intent here, there's information here. A person must have been behind this. because it's got information, it's got communication, it's got design, it's got purpose. Could a phone have come together, just swirling wind and everything, and put that together? No. Well, our minds are way more filled with information and design and intention. So, but what I do appreciate with this is sometimes you get in scientific debates with people over God, and it's around and around, and you don't get anywhere. You're on a carousel. So he says the better place to go is go from the argument of morality. So that's what he would say. Okay? So he says, what's better is to focus on your inner life. And this is what he says. There's the next quote. Now, the position would be quite hopeless, but for this. There is one thing and only one in the whole universe which we know more about than we could learn from an external observation. That one thing is man. In this case, we have, so to speak, inside information. We are in the know. And because of that, we know that men find themselves under a moral law which they did not make and which cannot quite forget, even when they try, and which they know they ought to obey. And then he uses that illustration. If you had a chance to read the chapter, I just find this one. He uses such really memorable, I think, very memorable, interesting illustrations. And one of them is like, I can make this inference. If I see a mail carrier dropping mail off at people's home, I could say, I bet there's a letter in there. Well, how do you know there's a letter in there? Because every time that mail carrier comes to my home, there is a letter that he drops off. Well, how do you know it's written in that letter? Well, I don't. The only one I get to read is the one addressed to me. And so that's what C.S. Lewis is saying. Like, we could debate science all day long, all that stuff going outside of us. And somebody said, well, that scientific discovery contradicts that one. And we can just go around and around all day long on that. But he says there's one thing that's written to all of us, written inside of us. It's that letter of the law written on our hearts. That's insider information. And that's something that you wouldn't even actually, C.S. Lewis says, you wouldn't even actually know about. Like if we just observed humans, we wouldn't even know that they were being moved by this. Like if let's say we were aliens that kind of came in and settled in on this world and were just observing human beings, we wouldn't know that they're kind of following this internal conscience every day saying, oh, I shouldn't have done that, or I should, all these shoulds that we tell ourselves. I ought to have done that, I shouldn't have done that. We wouldn't even know that they had this internal conscience that they're following, but we all, because we're humans, we know that because we have insider information. We know what that feels like to be pushed and tugged by a conscience, a law on the inside. So that's what he makes a big argument from. Okay, last chapter. Very good. Here we go. And again, all you people online, so you can start putting down any questions that you might have as well, and we'll try to answer them here as a big group. Okay, and that leads to chapter 5. We have a cause to be uneasy. So, first of all, he starts off by kind of, again, talking to his young self. The young self would have said to C.S. Lewis, young C.S. Lewis would have said, oh, now you're bringing religion. I knew that's where this was going. Bringing in the old religion, turning back the old religious clock. Didn't we deal with that already in the medieval times? Now we're more scientific. And he talked about how he went through this and how we can go through this. He calls it chronological snobbery. Chronological snobbery is this idea that whatever is the newest is the truest. Whatever is the newest and the latest is the best. And he says, what chronological snobbery? When you start reading these ancient voices, people were just as smart, just as wise on so many of these deep topics hundreds, thousands of years ago. And so check your chronological snobbery. And he says, so what if I'm going back to religion? If that's if that's where the truth is, the best thing to do is to go back to what worked in the past, right? Progress means, he says, progress means if you're going in the wrong direction, to turn around and go the opposite direction. Because you're not progressing anywhere further if you're going in the wrong direction. So if Christianity is true, or theism or whatever religion is true, the best way to have progress is to go back to something that was always true. So he already anticipates some of this chronological snobbery. Oh, now here we go to that ancient religion stuff again. I knew you were going to get there. Yeah, so what? And then he says, okay, there are two pieces of evidence that you could look at without the Bible, without Christianity, to know there's a God. He says there's the natural knowledge of nature. You can look out at nature. And he says, yeah, that's like kind of doing science. And he says, if we just look at nature, we know that God might, if there is a God, he's an artist. But that, man, we also look at nature and the world, and it can be kind of cruel. So is God cruel? And so he says that teaches us that he's powerful, that he's an artist, but doesn't tell us everything. And then we look inside of us, that second piece of information that there could be a God. We look at our conscience. And we know there's a law, and we're not living up to it. And he says, when you start facing some of these things, you know why people he says, this is why I ran from Christianity, because you start facing some of these facts, and it's scary. There's something real out there. There's a real law, and I'm not living up to it. And there's an all-powerful God who can, bring a hailstorm and bring a lightning storm and make an earthquake and these powerful works of nature. And I don't want to mess with that kind of God. So he says we have a cause to be uneasy. And so you have to face these facts. This fact that there seems to be a God, and we need a God because we need something that's good and true. There's some morality. We need morality to exist. We need purpose to exist. He says we need this God. We need a good God. But at the same time, this God that we need, we also run from, because we know that we don't deserve to be in his presence. And so we either can make up a God, we either can try to stop ourselves from thinking that there's a real law, that's really true, or we can try to deny God and become materialists. But he says we have a reason to be uneasy. This is hard stuff to think about. And I think that's why all of us, sometimes we want to run from religion, all of us. It's just too scary. Eternity facing a real God, and so we run from it. And so C.S. Lewis says, you have to start looking at these facts. Let's just look at them. Let's just believe them. Let's just be honest about them. There is a right and a wrong, and none of us is pulling it off. None of us. And so that leads us to this quote. My reason for my explanation so far, what he's talked about in these first 5 chapters, was that Christianity simply does not make sense until you have faced the sort of facts that I've been describing. Christianity tells people to repent and promises them forgiveness. It therefore has nothing, as far as I know, to say to people who do not know they have done anything to repent of and who do not feel they need any forgiveness. It is after you have realized that there is a moral law and a power behind that law, and that you have broken that law and put yourself wrong with that power, after all this, and not a moment sooner, that Christianity begins to talk. I love the way he writes. So this is when Christianity starts to make sense, when you actually don't run from this stuff. There is a creator. He is good. He's an artist. He's incredible. He's powerful. There is a power out there. There is a law out there, this law, this standard that we all are under and that's pressing down on us, and none of us is living up to it. And if we would have invented this law, we'd have made it easier. Why make, if you think about, why make the line something that you can't jump over? Why make it, or if you're doing the limbo, why make it so low that you can't get under it, right? Why make it so hard? Well, we didn't invent it. It's something that it's something that's true outside of us, okay? So, that just brings us this need, or this being open to Christianity. This is where you start. And so I think this can kind of help us for ourselves, like when we come to those points, so we say, maybe this Christianity thing's all wrong. Maybe I'm wrong about all this. Maybe I shouldn't believe in this. Maybe I just am believing this because my parents told me to believe in it. And you're starting to deconstruct your faith. This is a good place to start. Ask yourself, is there a right and wrong? And am I living up to it? And do I need some help? Do I need to be rescued? Do I need to be forgiven? So it's a good place to start for yourself. It's a good place to also discuss. I mean, we have got plenty of books now. If you don't already have one, grab another one. We've had quite a few people who've donated extra money. So if you don't have enough money to donate more, grab an extra one and give this to somebody and say, hey, read this first chapter and get back to me and tell me what you think. It's a great place to start with people because this was written by an atheist who became a Christian and who's an Oxford professor who has some things that really could be a great way to start conversation. So this is just the beginning. He says, I'm not even close to Christianity yet. I haven't even begun to talk about Christianity. We'll get into that next week. Next week, we're going to say, and Christianity, and only Christianity, answers these unique problems. Answers this question, where did the law come from? And how do we become kind of people who can live under it and doesn't press down and crush us? Only Christianity answers those two questions. And so we'll win that next week. Any questions that you have or comments that might be helpful for other people? I'm going to just look and see if there's any questions online. Any comments or questions that anybody has that you wanted to bring up? Yes?
What's theism?
Theism? So theism is just this idea that there is a God. We're not going to say who it is. It could be Zeus. It could be Allah. It could be, so theism, so what is theism? Theism is just, there is a metaphysical world. There is something behind, something up there. I don't know who it is. So C.S. Lewis says, I was an atheist, and then I became a theist. No God. Atheist means, A means against or not. Atheist means there's not a God. And then theism or theist means a God. So he went from no God to a God. I don't know which God is the right God. And then that's what he kind of is going to get into the next book, or is, all right, which God's the right God? Let's look at all the different religions that we're going to look at next week. Let's look at all the big ideas of religion. Which God is the right God, and could it be Christianity? Great question. Any other questions or comments on what we talked about tonight?
Is it also related to deists?
Yeah, same kind of idea. Deism, theism. A deist is just kind of believing in there's something out there. I believe, and I'm not going to say who it is. I think make it be a little squishy, but it's something out that are out there. That's a deist or a theist. Yeah. Yes, funny. Yeah. So very good. Atheism means no God. The A means in the Greek language means no, there's no God. And then agnostic, the A means I don't know. A is not, again, agnostic. And then gnostic means don't know, or knowledge. Gnostic means knowledge. So agnostic means I don't know.
So you're not agnostic, you just don't know.
You don't know. So atheism is, I say there's no God, I'm a materialist, there's just matter and nothing matters. Agnostic means not, and Gnostic means knowledge. I don't have knowledge. I don't know if there's a God or not. And then if I go over to theism or deism, then there's a God, and I got to pick which God is the right God. Right? Very good. Any other questions? All right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's so good. Thank you. For those of you who didn't hear it, this is important right now because of, there's so much secularism, right? And that's the same thing as materialism, secularism, this idea that there's a secular world, there's nothing beyond, nothing. And C.S. Lewis, if you read his autobiography on how he came to faith, Surprised by Joy, he talks about that, where I couldn't, as he says, there's these blasted Christians that are everywhere, that are writing all their books, and I just can't avoid them. And it's really dangerous for an atheist to be bumping into these good literature and good books and good art, because it messes with his narrow worldview of secularism. And I think it's just amazing how we can create our own worlds that we live in, have this confirmation bias that's called, right? And we have access to all this information, and yet we narrow ourselves to only information that kind of becomes this feedback loop of things that confirm what we already think. And so we follow ideas, if it's secularism or even Christianity, we follow things that match our worldview that just reinforce what we want to believe. And so let's say if you're a person that does feel guilt or shame, you have this law that's pressing down on you and you feel guilty, and so sometimes, or you had a really bad experience, and so all of a sudden you find a YouTuber that's saying, this stuff on the Bible is not historically accurate or not scientifically accurate, and you start clicking on it, and then it sends you to another video that confirms that, and then another scientist says, there's no God, and then you keep going down that road, and like I said, by the afternoon, you're already an atheist. But I think, reading a book like this, C.S. Lewis does a good job of just kind of laying out the different worldviews. We have to confront some of this stuff. Let's answer some of these objections. Let's not get caught in our own little corners, Christian or atheist, and let's look at the facts. What do you do with this idea that there is a law? What do you do that there is this right and wrong? And what do you do about this feeling of guilt and shame, I'm not living up to it? How do you resolve that? Yeah.
I just found it really interesting because so many times you feel like there is no common ground. There is no place that we can start at because we don't have any of the same cultural influences or the same things that lead us to one common point, a starting point.
Yeah.
Like he really strips it away to that. And what I have encountered, even within my family, is that whole thought that Christianity is a crutch for the mentally weak. And so I'm recognizing, rather than being paralyzed by a statement like that, I'm just kind of like, what you don't know how to respond to that, to instead take that as whenever people attack, there's usually something within them that's causing them to have that kind of reaction to it.
Yep.
And so to be able to go back and be very matter of fact with the steps that he's used, there's kind of nothing to attack there. It just is.
That's really good. So for those of you who are following online, the thought that was brought up was, this idea that what's the common ground that we have? And it's so hard to find common ground today. And then and then people saying that, oh, Christianity is just a crutch for the weak. But these facts of the right and wrong put us on some common ground. So very good, very good. I don't think. Okay, so there was some questions. It really doesn't seem like it really doesn't seem like we agree on right and wrong. Maybe we don't. And so in today's society, what do you do with that if you don't seem to agree on right and wrong, right? I think maybe we have to take a step back. Let's talk about, so today there are maybe different moralities when it comes to gender or sexuality or things like that, right? So then you say, all right, you have this view of gender and sexuality, Christianity has this view. It seems like we have two different moralities. But really, if you take a step back behind that, you have this idea that I have my right to have this kind of lifestyle, that this person with this different lifestyle should have these rights that need to be validated. If we would step back, one step back, where did human rights come from? So maybe we don't agree on this issue of sexuality or different things like that, but let's take one step back, and what about human rights? Where did that come from? Why do I have to adhere to your view and give rights to a human being? Why is that so important? Well, human rights comes from Genesis chapter 1, that we were all created in God's image. And there's no basis for human rights outside of Christian morality. So where did that idea that we should care about what other person, a human being and their right to have these different views? So I think, there might be, initially there might be some disagreement, but if we take a step even back farther, we will find some common ground where if you keep asking questions, you will get to a place of some morality that you'll say, oh yeah, we both agree on that. Well, where does that come from? So, all right, I think that's probably good. If there's any other things here online, I'll answer those individually. If you won't mind, if you don't want to stay, you don't have to stay, you can leave. But if you wouldn't mind talking to the person next to you, or in two or threes, there's 3 questions on the back. What made you take this class? And based on what you learned in the class, how might your conversations about Christianity be different? And then what is one thing you learned from the class? Now, also, in addition, throughout the week, I will put kind of some questions up on our Victory app. So if you go to that, Your Daily Victory app, there is a discussion board. I just encourage everybody to maybe answer one question this week on that app, just so we can keep this conversation going. And we'll have another class next week at 6:30. So answer those 3 questions with the person next to you, and then you are free to go. And if you have more questions, like to talk to me, that would be fine. Let's just close with a word of prayer, and you can get to your discussion. Lord God, thank you again for this time to gather around your word and consider your existence and your power and your love. Open up our hearts so that we would believe the truth and find ways to speak the truth in love. In your name we pray, amen. All right. Thank you, guys. So next week we'll read book 2. Thank you. If book 2 for next week, I'll be teaching on book 2.